I saw the ugliest face of statism during the COVID era. People say it was like a weird kind of deviation. The reality is that it was a logical extension of the centralized coercive state that has that power at its fingertips and can easily harness people's fears to abuse that power. Some people think, you want to change the whole of society. This is just crazy. How are you going to do this? It's just impossible.
Press pause on the Matrix for a second. If you're here, it's probably because you know something is off. You're not crazy, you're waking up, and this podcast is for you. So hit subscribe and join us at danastingregory.com/podcast to keep your mind sharp and your soul free. Welcome to the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast. Live free and prosper. What if the very system that we've been taught to depend upon is actually the greatest threat to human flourishing? In today's episode, we're diving deep into one of the boldest questions of our time. Is the modern nation state obsolete, and what could possibly replace it? My guest is returning guest Dr. David Thunder, political philosopher, senior researcher at the University of Navarra, and the author of The Polycentric Republic. In his new book, David offers a radical but deeply thoughtful alternative to centralized systems and a vision for building a freer, more flourishing society from the ground up. This is a conversation that challenges conventional thinking and invites us to imagine a new way forward. And if you're ready to take these ideas even further, I'm excited to invite you to join us for the Thinking Society, a powerful 6-part course where David Thunder, alongside 2 other world-class instructors, David Sharon-Lambos and Sinead Stringer, will help you to build the critical thinking skills, systems awareness, and leadership to thrive in a changing world. To find out more and to get a taste of what the Thinking Society is all about, we're hosting a free live webinar where you can meet the instructors, dive into the core ideas, and explore how you can play a role in shaping the future. It's completely free to attend. Just head over to weareelevate.org/thinking society to reserve your spot today. That's weareelevate.org/thinking society, and you'll find the link below. Now, let's dive into this fascinating conversation with Dr. David Thunder.
David, your book opens with a bold critique of the modern state. What was the moment that led you to question the legitimacy of the system that most people accept without hesitation?
Well, first of all, thanks, Dan, for having me on. This is a great opportunity to discuss the issues that I develop in this book, the problems that I examine in this book, and the solutions that I offer. The first thing I'd say is that there wasn't one specific moment, but in which I questioned the system that we live under. But I would say that I have a very kind of questioning kind of personality, a skeptical personality. I like to understand the reasons why things are as they are, and sometimes even to the point of being annoying, where I'll ask people, why are you demanding this of me, or why are you doing it this way and not some other way? I remember even when I was small and I believed in Santa Claus, and I absolutely had to have an explanation of how he got down the chimney with the fire on, and I ultimately just attributed it to magic. But in my worldview, I needed everything to be properly explained, and I think that was the starting point. That's sort of my approach, the intuitive, instinctive approach to life. And living in the United States, I went to do my PhD there. I noticed that a lot of Americans are much less accepting. Let's say they have less uncritical acceptance of the state. They're more critical of the idea that the state kind of will fix all our problems, or the state is the source of order. I learned a little bit to be a bit more critical of the state from my American friends, who, and on the other hand, also to be open to the idea that order can come from other sources besides the official sources and besides the state. And when I came to Spain 12 years ago, I came to a very different situation in which many people were extremely statist in their mentality. and really believed that, the state is preventing us from falling into total chaos. And without the state, everything would just fall apart. And there was, I would say, a certain slavishness in people's reverence towards the state. But on the other hand, I also saw how inefficient and disruptive state regulations were. And I think that was probably the most important turning point for me, was noticing how the state hyper-regulates all of these different spheres of life in very counterproductive and ill-informed ways. And I'll just give you a few examples. Say, for example, universities, a private university where I'm at, University of Navarra, is regulated by the state and told how to structure its curriculum, how to structure its PhD programs, many, many details of the day-to-day life of the university are shaped by state-imposed regulations. And I just wondered, why is this the case? What is being achieved by this level of intrusive regulation? Well, the answer is you're getting accreditation from the state. But of course, the bigger answer is it's not necessary. It's completely unnecessary, because the people within the university are perfectly competent to be able to design their own PhD programs. And if there is an accreditation system, it could be a lot more light touch, and it wouldn't even have to be state sponsored. And the same applies for the school system, which is even private schools. In order to get the benefits of public funding, they have to submit to very intrusive regulations about curriculum, about timetables. It takes the initiative away from them about how to design their programs, what pedagogy to implement. I have friends who are farmers, and the state tells them, well, the European Commission, perhaps the European Union, and the state, the Spanish state, tell them that they have to be able to geolocate all of their sheep at every moment, right? Talking about let's talk about look after your sheep. Well, I asked them, why do you have to have a geolocation for all of your sheep? And they said, because the state requires it. And I said, I understand that, but how does this help you do your job better as a farmer? And they said, it doesn't. I don't need to geolocate my sheep. It's just an environmental regulation that has been passed down through the state. And I could go on and on. Accounting, I could talk to about different sectors of society that have these absurd regulations imposed on them that make their life more difficult, that waste their time. And the common denominator is that it's people who don't really know what they're doing and don't know the sector intimately from the inside out who are imposing these regulations. And I think that really shaped my view of the state and shaped my view of, let's say, the benefits and advantages of a centralized state, the disadvantages of a centralized state. And then finally, we got to the pandemic, to the COVID era. And all of these tendencies of micromanagement, intrusive regulation, and let's say top-down impositions were multiplied and enhanced during that era on the pretext that the state was going to save our lives from a deadly virus. And during that era, I would say during those years, that I saw the ugliest face of statism and of centralism. But it's important to note that this was just an exaggerated form of the pathology. The initial pathology was the overly intrusive and regulatory state that doesn't make efficient use of our resources, our taxes, and doesn't regulate in a way that is well informed. Well, all of that was just enhanced and made even worse during the COVID era, when we couldn't even walk our children in Spain for some of that during about a month of the pandemic. We couldn't even walk our children. I didn't have children at the time, thankfully, Because imagine you're cooped up in a flat with children and you can't walk them outside, and people can walk their dogs, but they can't walk their children. So all that craziness, people say it was like a weird kind of deviation. The reality is that it was a logical extension of the centralized coercive state that has that power at its fingertips, and therefore can easily abuse that power and can easily harness people's fears during a pandemic to abuse that power.
If you're finding yourself nodding along, realizing just how deeply these centralized systems are failing us, then you're not alone. This is exactly why we've created the Thinking Society, a powerful 6-part course designed to help you to think more critically, understand systems more deeply, and take meaningful action to build freer, flourishing communities. And the best part, you can get a taste of it for free. We're hosting a free live event where you will meet David Thunder and our 2 other world-class instructors and explore the first steps to creating real change from the ground up. Just head to weareelevate.org/Thinking Society to reserve your spot. That's weareelevate.org/Thinking Society. You'll find the link in the description. Now back to the show.
So all of these events helped to shape my skepticism about the centralized state.
Thanks, David. Charles Eisenstein, and I'm glad you alluded to the fact that this wasn't just a sudden appearance of these types of behaviors. It was an escalation, and a significant escalation. But as Charles Eisenstein says, the table was already set in many ways, that the conditions were already right for this type of escalation. Like yourself, I grew up with a similar curiosity, and in fact, my skepticism of government specifically began when I was very young. I remember my dad was a serial watcher or viewer of the 6 o'clock news in the UK, BBC, 6 o'clock. I can still hear the countdown that would begin before the news happened. And then when I grew up a bit more, I could see he would watch the 10 o'clock news as well, which was largely the same stories. But I remember watching the 6 o'clock news with him, and there was these grey-haired men in big baggy suits jeering at one another across these green leather benches. And I asked my dad what this was, and he said, "That's Parliament, son. That's your government." And I said, "Well, what does the government do?" And he said that they run the country. And I thought, even at like 7 or 8 years old, I thought, really? They're just jeering and pointing and all kinds of tomfoolery. I thought that can't be the way that the country is run. And even to this day, it's still basically, some of the faces might have changed just about, but it's that's how the country is run. So I had very early skepticism, but from my own curiosity, I wanted to know what was happening, how it works, and that's always been a condition with which I viewed this. And then recently, David, I've interviewed quite a few people who specialize in education or parenting, really to explore the question, how do we raise free and independent children? And what's fascinating, the parallels from what you've just described about that kind of state skepticism that you experienced in the United States versus the statism in the parts of Spain that you were residing in. It feels very similar to the different parenting styles that they describe. There's like an authoritarian parenting style where the parent tries to control every aspect of the child's development. And then there's more a libertarian or approach, which is seeking to empower the child to become independent and to make their own decisions and make their own mistakes. But ultimately, as a parent, your goal is to provide your child with the best possible start in life so that they can flourish on their own 2 legs when they finally leave the nest. So that seems radically similar to the way the government treats its citizens, but we are, of course, no longer children. We are adults, and therefore, and any parent will know, as much as they think they're an expert in certain things, the reality is no parent can be an expert in every facet of your child's life, even when they become an adult. And that, for me, is one of the biggest fallacies of government, is that they somehow have precedent over every area of our lives and have a better, all this technocratic understanding of what leads to a flourishing life for its citizens. So I share those concerns. Before I ask my next question, do you have a response to that?
Individuals are likely to have a better grasp of their own fundamental interests than a government, because they're so up close to their own life. they can see the contours of their own life up close, and therefore they can understand much better what they need to thrive than a distant bureaucrat or an official, a public official. And I think this is a really profound point that has big implications for how we think about government, because it doesn't mean we shouldn't have any government. It just means that we should be very careful about the functions we assign to a government, because the fact of the matter is the kind of knowledge that a distant official can have about my life, my family, and my community is a very mediated, abstracted, generalized kind of knowledge that's often tabulated literally in Excel sheets, spreadsheets. I memorized a little bit of the COVID statistics and so on, but even environmental statistics and so on. It's generalizable, tabulated knowledge. And that knowledge does not make full contact with the circumstances that we live in, that we live our lives in, and our communities live in. And I think that's a really important point. And it just means that if they act on that partial abstracted knowledge, they will end up, governors, rulers, will often end up, let's say, intervening in counterproductive or destructive ways in local communities, and which they have done historically in many cases. So we need to it's epistemic humility that we need in governments, and we need institutions to kind of correspond to that epistemic humility, that restraint, to recognize there's only so much they can do competently because their knowledge is so limited about how local communities function.
Absolutely. I mean, if I even look at my two neighbors on either side of us, we have such radically different lives, radically different needs, and therefore even if limited to our own neighborhood, the two houses next door to me have very different requirements, let alone the whole street, the whole community, the whole town, the whole country. So that abstraction is really important. Now, in the book, you talk about the modern state as monocentric, a concentration of political authority in a single sovereign power. I would ask if you, first, for those who don't understand the term, could you define the term for us and explain why this model is inherently flawed or harmful to human flourishing?
Sure. Yeah. So monocentric just simply means that there's a single center of power and authority that has a commanding position in the system as a whole. So it doesn't mean that it necessarily decides everything that happens in the system, but it does mean that it has it's kind of like a court of last appeal, a final appeal. It's like a triangle of sorts in which some issues may get decided at the local level, but in cases of disputes, there's an escalation of disputes. They will end up at the top of the triangle, which is the centralized state. And also it means that there's a kind of a sense in which this unit at the top has a kind of a general purpose oversight over social life, over social and political and coordination and economic life. And we call that, the term that I use for that is sovereignty. The idea that there is a government that is sovereign. And here I mean domestically. I don't mean immunity from external interference here. I'm talking about internal sovereignty, as in being the organ of governance that has presumptive oversight, let's say, presumptive right to oversee and regulate social life as a whole. And that's a very distinctively modern idea of government. It wouldn't be the Middle Ages. That would be unthinkable, for example, because of the pluralization of authorities and the ambiguity of different authorities, whether church authorities or the nobles or kings, and so forth. But we have basically in the modern era concentrated authority in a central government. This started with absolutism, with the absolutist monarchs, who basically appropriated all of the dispersed authority in society, concentrated in their own hands, and created what is known as monarchical absolutism, which is a kind of a supreme authority in society concentrated in the person of the king or queen. And what happened in the democratic era is that concentrated authority was passed into a parliament, was transmitted into a parliament and democratized, meaning that there was a kind of a popular legitimation of that authority. The people had the last say, according to this story, the familiar democratic story. And if the people vote for the parliament, then they have given their authority and their sovereignty to the parliament. So the sovereignty used to come from God, and it came to the king from God, right? That was the idea. But in the democratic era, the sovereignty no longer comes from God. The sovereignty comes from the people, and it gets concentrated in a national parliament. And of course, structurally, this is quite similar to monarchical absolutism, even though it has constitutional constraints. The characteristic that it shares is the concentration of general purpose authority in the hands of a few. That is something that modern parliaments have in common with monarchical absolutists or absolutist monarchs. And that is the feature that I draw attention to in the book of our modern societies. It's a contingent feature of our societies. It's not necessary. It's not unavoidable. And basically that's, I think, very important, that it's not just the kind of a natural condition. It's actually a historical evolution that was made possible by absolutism and by the destruction of rival social authorities in the Middle Ages. So basically, why is this problematic? This is problematic basically because human beings are social by nature, and they access their flourishing by participating in social groups of lots of different sorts of social groups, from starting with the family. But then you talk about, you think of neighborhood, you think of this Elevate platform, you think of a university, of a school, of the business, of a municipality. Right? There's so many different types of social formations or groups that we participate in, and they need to be self-regulating, because it's the people inside the group who understand the conditions under which that group can flourish. They understand the ins and outs, the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life in the group. And so if you delegate that governance, if you kind of subcontract it or delegate it out to a higher government, say the government of the state, then what happens is that government will not have the knowledge, because it won't understand exactly how your group, what its needs are, how it needs to be governed, and it won't have the motivation, because its loyalties will be elsewhere. Its loyalties will be to the careers of politicians, to the future of political parties, and to, let's say, in the best case scenario, to the preservation of democratic institutions, which is fine. Democratic constitutional institutions. That's a fine loyalty to have, but it's not the same as having a loyalty to the preservation of local social groups and their development and their flourishing. Ultimately, the bottom line is that the centralized monocentric state is hubristic. It's a prideful enterprise in which an exaggerated amount of power and authority is placed in the hands of a few who presume to bring order to the country as a whole. But I'm sure this will come up in our conversation, but are failing to do that. And that failure is systemic. That failure is not just, if we had a few more competent people in Parliament, everything would go better. No, it's a systemic problem. It's a structural problem. The problems we're facing cannot be solved in a top-down centralized way.
Well, let's lean into that, because the modern nation state has taken this form in the United Kingdom and various other parts of the world, large parts of the world, actually. So I'm curious to understand from your perspective and from your analysis in the book why this has led to a breakdown in freedom, trust, civic responsibility, but also failed when it comes to our own flourishing as a society. What do you think are the key failure points that this model has demonstrated?
Highly centralized general purpose authority doesn't have either the knowledge or the motivation to be able to solve local problems that have local manifestations that are very complex. And the particular types of problems, let's say the illustrations of this pathology or the manifestations of this pathology, would be a whole bunch of issues that are facing the state today. I'll mention a few. One is the welfare state. So the welfare state is suffering because of a demographic crisis, because we're basically not having enough babies to fund the welfare state to keep it functional, so that we can actually have enough input, enough of an income for the welfare state to be able to keep making the payouts for people's healthcare, for people's pensions, and so on. So that's one issue, and that's a huge issue facing Western states today. And because it's so complex, and there's so many issues, from the free rider problem of people using the welfare state irresponsibly, to the problem of poor management, inefficient use of resources, and the need for much more intense partnerships between public and private bodies. All of these issues cannot be solved by diktat from some sort of like armchair position of a minister of education, of healthcare or something like that. And this is recognized now. It's almost universally recognized that the welfare state is in crisis. And in fact, in the United Kingdom, there is an effort to begin to decentralize. There have been efforts to decentralize the healthcare system, to give more power to regional authorities. And that's partly a corroboration, if you want, of the point I'm making, which is that highly centralized authorities cannot solve these complex problems. So welfare is one issue that I think is pretty critical. And another issue is political polarization. And political polarization has a lot to do with diversification of populations, of ideology, of commitments, of religions. In a very pluralistic population, citizens and groups will form very different political opinions. And in a large-scale social unit, such as, say, a state-based society, the sheer amount of diversity is just breathtaking, political, ideological, moral, religious. And what will happen is that they will end up having to try to leverage the institutions of the state to try to get their way, different groups. And that will create a kind of political warfare that will be reflected through party politics, through polarization, through populist leaders, etc. And it's really a zero-sum game, because whoever gets control of the state will get their vision implemented, right? And the losers, if you want to put it that way, are going to be so peed off by this, so pissed off by this, so annoyed that they will feel resentful, and they will feel excluded from their society, and they'll feel kind of put down and humiliated.
And they'll set fire to Teslas in the street.
Well, exactly. I mean, or they'll riot. They'll do whatever they want to do. They'll riot. Yeah. They'll stop voting, maybe, and they will feel less of a sense of loyalty, possibly, to public institutions. And so, the crisis of efficacy, if you want, of national policies in things like welfare, and healthcare, is going to be accentuated by a crisis of legitimacy, which is that a lot of citizens will be unhappy with the policies being implemented. Even if the policies are more or less effective, they will be morally out of kilter with a large amount of the population. And so, you might wonder, well, then how will a decentralized system solve this problem? Well, it solves the problem basically by removing a lot of issues from the national stage and relegating them to a more local level. where there will be much less, there will be diversity, but the diversity will be mitigated. It will be more contained than at the national level, logically, because we're talking about a smaller demographic. And also, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but in a polycentric system, in a highly federated system where each unit has a high degree of, let's say, autonomy, you also have a mobility which can greatly mitigate the issue of polarization, because citizens can gravitate towards parts of the country that are more in sync with their ideals. And therefore, this natural self-selection process, or voting with your feet, will mean that regions will become more cohesive politically and more kind of a bit less unstable, because you won't be forcing all of these different people to live together who have such very different ideals of life and of politics. They will be able to, there'll be an escape route for them from the national community in a sense, or national policy, because they will be able to migrate to regions of the country that are more amenable to their beliefs or their commitments. Yes, so I did get ahead of myself, but I think that's okay. It's a natural segue to explain, the contrast between hypercentralization and a polycentric or decentralized type of political system.
Yes, before we move on to talk about such an alternative, I do want to ask another question about polarization, because for me, this is a function of the modern world, perhaps exacerbated by social media and the digital world that we live in. Perhaps that is the sole transformative element. But it feels like now we live in such a bifurcated society. It's almost society is split along binary lines. It's become so oversimplified into view A versus view B, or team A versus team B, politician A versus politician B, party A, red party versus blue party. There is no seemingly diversity of ideas in that polarized point, at least not publicly or visibly. And it does almost feel like now there are, you're splitting populations in half, and it's increasingly feeling like such groups can't even live together anymore. It feels so, the animosity is so strong online, at least. Fortunately, it hasn't necessarily spilled over into the physical world, although we are seeing evidence of that. And I think if we experience greater economic deprivation, then that could rear its ugly head in different ways. What do you think has contributed to this rise in polarization politically? Because I'm only 41 years old, but I've seen enough parliamentary changes, and it feels like back in the day, with my rose-tinted glasses, that you may disagree with politicians, you may be unhappy with government, but I'd never seen it so divisive as it is today. What in your view has led to this? Is this a function of the monocentric state itself, or is it a broader set of factors?
Well, it's a combination of factors. One factor is rapid social change and economic change, and because of the level at which economies are globalizing, the speed at which they're globalizing, and they're becoming more globally interdependent. Even think of technological change and how that can just decimate local industries very rapidly, like automobile industries, for example. Because of automation, a lot of their workforce becomes redundant. Or think of although maybe that hasn't completely sunk in yet, but AI is going to have artificial intelligence is going to have a major impact on, it'll be very disruptive, and it'll cause in the short term, a lot of economic hardship and I would say trauma for a lot of people who are trained for a different kind of world. Something a little analogous to what happened to the automobile industry. And I think that these then combine that also, of course, migration changes the kind of the ideological and cultural constitution of society, if you want, and this can be perceived as a threat by a lot of people. rightly or wrongly. But I mean, it's a human reaction, instinctive reaction, when you see your society change rapidly, to feel sort of threatened and feel a sense of disorientation. And under those circumstances, different people will and groups will naturally have different ways of reacting to this new situation, and they'll present different solutions. So, for example, what does a managed migration policy look like? Some people will have a more reactionary approach, which would be kind of like shut off the immigration completely. And then other people will have a more moderate approach of, let's try to, have better controls on immigration and better strategies of integration or whatever. But this creates rifts in the population, because in the face of these rapid changes, the old standard solutions probably won't work. And so people have to imagine new ways of living together. And there's a lot at stake, because people feel their very future is at stake, the future of their societies. So if I'm on team A and we have this solution to a rapidly changing social and economic situation, whether it be protectionism or more free trade, or whether it be close the borders, or let's just have better controls on immigration, I will think that my team needs to win to secure the future for our society, and team B will probably think similarly, and this will create a major tension in our society. Now, what doesn't help is the fact that we live in societies governed by centralized states, because the centralized states force us to, in a way, implement a one-size-fits-all solution to a lot of these problems through our national executives, parliaments, and judiciaries. And I think this is highly destructive for the moment we live in particular. I think it's not good in general, but I think that pathology of top-down power and authority, all the pathologies associated with that, are going to be accentuated in an era of, let's say, accelerated complexity and rapid change, because centralized top-down institutions are not agile enough to adapt to these problems. And they also end up implementing one solution, which encourages a highly partisan form of politics, where, a kind of almost majoritarian form of politics, which is very dangerous and very toxic. And so even though we're living in a challenging time, if we had a more polycentric political system, for viewers who are not familiar with that language, it just is basically decentralized, basically having lots of different independent centers of governance. What that permits is two things. One, it diffuses the population by dividing them into, let's say, different constituencies, whether it be geographically or in terms of issues, so that we don't have this kind of national polarization and a fight to control one parliament. So it has a diffusing effect, which is very important. And also, polycentrism permits a very important thing, which is social experimentation and political experimentation. If you are not able to experiment with different solutions, your ability to learn is radically hampered, because if you can't try out different policy principles, you can't really know for sure which one works best. Because what you're going to end up doing is you're going to bring in an expert, right, who will tell you, this is the best policy because I've run a regression analysis, and I've seen that with these correlations, assuming this kind of behavior, these incentives, that people will get better economic outcomes with this policy. And, with all due respect to my economic colleagues and my, other academic colleagues and people in government who think they're experts, who maybe have certain legitimate expertise, with all due respect, there is absolutely no substitute for experience. And so even the best trained PhD or, academic cannot cannot provide a form of knowledge that dispenses with the need for experimentation and experimental learning. And let's see if I can think of an example. I mean, something like, say, tax levels. How can we know what the optimal taxation level is to get good public services and to allow people to live decent ways of life? Well, am I going to make a model and figure that out with a model in my living room or in my lab? I could do that, or somebody who had econometric training could try to do that. But that model will always fall short because he won't be able to anticipate all of the complexity of how these policies will work out on the ground, because science can't do that. But that's another discussion. Science can't really figure out exactly how these things play out. It's too complex. So what you end up doing is, in a polycentric system, is you allow different governments to try out different tax systems, and the citizens will notice in their lives how those tax systems are working and how their public services are working. And there will be a kind of a very tangible sense of benefit and payoff to different taxation systems. And in a competitive systems with mobility, with social and political mobility, citizens will be able to vote with their feet, and they will be attracted towards regions that have more effective and competitive taxation policies. So that's just one example of how practical experimentation is so important in order to learn what the best policies are. I guess I don't want to make this all about COVID, but because it's so recent in our memory, I guess it is very vivid. It's only because a part of the world did not lock down. It's only because of that we can be pretty sure that the lockdowns were ineffective at containing disease in the long term, and in decreasing mortality. We can be pretty sure of that. But how can we know that? We could know it by the best proof of that is by having contrasting groups in which there was a lockdown in one society and there was not in another. And I think you can apply that to any policy issue, really, most policy issues. And in societies that are highly centralized and state-centric, the potential for learning from social experimentation and policy experimentation is radically reduced, drastically reduced. And we're literally trying to fix our social problems with our eyes almost blindfolded, because we're not able to see how different policies could play out on the ground. We're making intuitive guesses, if you want.
Yeah, no, David, I think, COVID is, we're now 5 years on, but as it happens, as we're recording this, we're in the first week of lockdown. 5 years on now from the first week of lockdowns in the United Kingdom and England. So there's a lot of looking back to be done, but I think if there's one time in history that illustrates the risks of a one-size-fits-all policy, it is COVID, the response to COVID. And you're absolutely right. In the absence of a competition of ideas, but it also illustrates all of the points you've made around the flaws of modeling. I mean, that was highly visible. Every single model failed. Every single model failed to include the scale of assumptions you'd have to make in order to accurately determine a model is outrageous. And a lot of those conditions were built around very small filters. If the goal is to minimize COVID cases, then you overlook every other aspect of human flourishing. And if you just take that approach to every government policy at a centralized level, you get all of the problems magnified. So I think, you very well articulated the problems of the centralized state. My question is, are people even able to imagine a society that is organized in a different way, because we become so accustomed to a single sovereign power in the state, in the government, of the two-party system, a duopoly, effectively. Even if there is third or fourth parties in the race, there's really only two parties. And people have become so accustomed to that way of living that they almost can't imagine a different way of living. Do you think it's possible for us to even start to consider alternatives in the face of this experience and conditioning?
Yes, I think it is possible. I agree that our
imagination. You've been able to imagine it.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do in this book, and so the point of this book is to basically, stimulate people's imagination and challenge their imagination, to expand it, really, to expand how we think, our ways of thinking about order, about how society functions, how we, how we access our flourishing, or how we realize flourishing lives, and what kinds of governmental systems we need to realize flourishing lives. And of course, the narrative, it's all about storytelling. Storytelling shapes us much more than abstract theories. It's the stories that shape our imagination. And one of those stories that we've been told, or that have somehow reached us by osmosis, is that society is basically a big group of individuals who made a contract to agree to have a government over them. And to simplify somewhat, right? We just like a bunch of individuals who together we jointly authorize a government to have power over us, and that government then will kind of keep law and order and generally look out for the public interest. That story is one of the biggest obstacles to reform and to progress, because it leaves out a fundamental reality, aspect of reality, which is that society is not simply a bunch of individuals. Society is actually a jungle, a network, a thick network of associations and groups that need to collaborate with each other and collaborate internally in order to advance their ends, their purposes. And the social contract, if we can speak of a social contract, at least as a metaphor, as a kind of consensual form of social order, is the parties to the social contract are not just individuals. They're corporate groups, they're associations, they're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're churches, they're universities, they're schools. All of these corporations or groups have distinctive shared interests, and those interests need to be protected by the wider social order and recognized by it. And so I think that obviously I wouldn't have written this book if I thought that our imagination was completely impervious to change, and there was no way of stretching it beyond its current limits. And so I think it is possible to stretch the imagination, and I think history is important. I think knowing a little bit more about history is important, and knowing that the sovereign state, the sovereign modern state, the modern sovereign centralized state is not the only deal. It's not the only type of government that we've had historically. And I think just thinking about different examples of other systems, like, say, the Swiss Confederation, which has been in existence for hundreds of years. And even though right today it's become more centralized, it's still much more bottom up than, say, the United Kingdom in its political system. So basically, you have these cities and towns and surrounding regions or cantons, and these cantons, these local political units or regional political units, basically have very substantial taxing power and policy-making powers. And yes, they have delegated some powers upwards. That's the nature of a federation, that you have some general powers in the higher levels of government. But they retain very significant powers. And in fact, they have traditionally had more taxing power than the national government. So it's the inverse of many national states today, where the most taxing power is at the top, and then local authorities have less taxing power. So that's one example, the Swiss Confederation. And then the Hanseatic League was a league of merchant cities in the north of Europe from the 14th to the 16th centuries. Well, it was actually more time than that, but that's kind of at its peak. It was from the 14th to the 16th centuries. And these merchant cities basically formed a strategic alliance for trade and for defense, right? And they would send their delegates to one of the towns to confer and to make common decisions. Now, that kind of model of essentially a city league, which was very successful and very vibrant and lasted for hundreds of years, that kind of model is radically different to the centralized state, because it doesn't even have a state. The Hanseatic League is not a state, right? When you think about it, it's literally a league. It's an alliance of cities that cooperate and have some, yes, overarching rules, and they have enforcement mechanisms, but they don't have, a really complicated state bureaucracy. They don't have what you might call what we understand as a sovereign state, with all of the paraphernalia and apparatus surrounding that. They're an alliance, a strategic alliance. And I think for hundreds of years, we've been brainwashed into thinking that, in a sense, we've been programmed into thinking that order is the sovereign state. That is order. And there is no other alternative. And history shows otherwise. I'm not saying that these historical examples, are kind of idyllic or perfect or utopias, right? Because somebody's going to come back and say to me probably, oh, well, the Hanseatic League, they were oligarchic. Those cities were run by elites and by oligarchs. They weren't run properly democratically and stuff. And there wasn't enough local say, perhaps by ordinary citizens. And I think they'd be missing the point if they said that, because my point is simply that it is possible to achieve, a shared civil order that is more or less stable through polycentric forms of governance that are not highly centralized. That's the point. And if you want to tweak them, and if you want to have more democratically organized cities that enter into an alliance with each other, great. That's perfect. I'm happy with that. But the point is that these historical examples stretch our imagination, and they are a counterexample to disprove the myth that we absolutely need decentralized states, and there's no other game in town.
Absolutely. David, this is fascinating. So I think many of us now understand that we've reached the kind of tolerable limits of this centralized system. In fact, I was part of a workshop recently where we posed the question, what, if any, what should be the responsibility of a overarching state or government? And for 2 hours, we couldn't come up with a common set of understanding. But what was very clear, that it would be radically reduced. I think in this modern world, it's become like this vacuum that is sucked in almost every facet of our lives. And rather than those decision-making powers being decentralized and localized, where, as you say, become much more closer to those who are affected by the policies and decisions, it's now been assumed by this single sovereign authority. And it feels like over time, almost that somehow the modern state has just assumed all of these powers, absorbed all of these powers into its infrastructure and its paraphernalia, as you say. And I would love to imagine what that could look like as an alternative. understanding more about how we can decentralize and move towards some of the models you've described historically and what that would look like in a modern sense. And to help with that, if I was to wake up tomorrow and by magic here in Bournemouth, we were part of a new polycentric republic. And by the way, before I ask this question, could you explain the republic part? So polycentric, we're understanding the decentralization. What does the term republic mean in this case?
Yeah. Republic, basically, although I do speak less about the idea of republic in the book, but I do discuss it. And it comes from Latin res publica, which means the common thing or the public thing, right? Literally, the public thing, the thing that belongs to the people, right? The thing that belongs to us, the people. And the reason why I decided the language of republic was important, that I wanted to include that in the title, is because I haven't given up on the idea of a shared constitution. I haven't given up on the idea of a shared horizon of meaning and value that would help to anchor this political community. And I like the idea of Res Publica because I think, well, partly because there's a long tradition of civic republicanism that emphasizes the importance of citizens rallying around certain public values, shared values, and shared institutions. And the only difference is there are some people who call themselves Republicans. I don't use that in a derogatory way. I mean, some people who would say they are Republicans, but they would be highly nationalist, highly statist types of Republicans that see republicanism as being expressed in the institutions of a centralized state, right? The big difference with polycentric republicanism is that that the public thing, the shared values, the shared institutions, are not a centralized state and its values, but rather they are a federal system and a loose overarching constitution that protects very basic rights and liberties, such as things like bodily integrity, the right to move between regions, so the right to migrate, and the right to hold property, the right to enter into contracts with others and to have those contracts honored. But in general, the idea is that the type of shared order is the consequence of working together to build it. And so it's an emergent order that arises through multilateral cooperation and arises through evolving customs and norms. And there is an economist, economical thinker called Hayek, who a lot of people will be familiar with, Friedrich Hayek, who talks about the impersonal order or the general norms, the general impersonal rules that regulate our social life among strangers. People who are not intimate buddies or friends, or they don't live in the same town, but they want to be trade with each other and have exchanges of various sorts. They want to have a safe social space to be able to move through. And there are these very general norms that just spontaneously evolve and emerge to regulate our social life. And they can be complemented by legislation, of course, and interpreted by legislation. But this general framework of norms is part of the res publica, it's part of the republic. And the death of the republic is not a coup or necessarily a revolution. That's not the death of the republic necessarily, because a republic could survive a revolution and a coup. But what it cannot survive is the breakdown in the shared social norms that make our common life possible, and the shared social norms and trust among citizens. And those bonds are cultivated through cooperation and through sharing social spaces, being involved in shared projects, And I think that's kind of where I want to go with the idea of republic. A real lived unity that is achieved through cooperation and mostly through conventional shared values and norms that are that can be institutionalized, but the codification is much less important than having these shared conventions. In fact, the less codification, the more healthy the society is, the less it'll be codified, because basically people will rely more on the conventions and the shared trust than on the let's say the police powers of the state or the judiciary. So I'm not saying we should get rid of police or get rid of judiciary, but I'm saying in this system, the culture that evolves and emerges through cooperation plays a critical role, the shared culture, and a much more important role than, let's say, the political and judicial institutions, or even the electoral institutions. They all have a role to play, but the shared civic culture is absolutely critical.
Yeah, David, I want to explore this a bit more before I get into some of the practicalities, because it feels like right now the shared norms and values have shattered. Certainly in the United Kingdom, clearly in America, other parts of the world, we've seen this polarization, division, as we've already talked about, in terms of the absolute tribalization of society. How would you go about restoring a shared sense of values and norms, and how would you do this in a way that was not done in a centralized fashion? Because he sort of described it as this iterative, evolving, emergent property. How do you then, without codification or codification, how do you then really identify that? And how is that different then from having nationalism, where you kind of rally behind the idea of the culture of your nation, for instance, or the national identity that has been created again through history?
Yeah. I think I distinguish between let's say national identity and statism. I think I would have to distinguish between those two things first, and say that you can have a national identity without a strong centralized state. Because a national identity is compatible with very decentralized forms of federalism, for example, right, or political decentralization. So that would be the first thing. And also national identities can be more or less capacious, more or less, let's say, expansive and tolerant. So if, for example, you have to be white and red-haired in order to be British, Irish, or whatever, then a lot of people are in big trouble, aren't they? Because they can't be part of that national identity. I was obviously being facetious about the red-haired part, but yes. So a highly racial national identity obviously is deeply problematic in a society with high levels of migration and ethnic diversity. So part of the issue is rethinking national identity so that it's more expansive and more tolerant of diverse manifestations. But part of it is also pluralism, genuine internal pluralism, and that means that, let's say, the national values that are shared would have to be pretty minimal in a relatively fragmented society such as the ones we live in today. It would have to be pretty minimal, and it might include things like rule of law, freedom of contract, bodily integrity, right of private property. It would have certain very core fundamentals. But then each political community that makes up the composite of the republic would have their own interpretation of those core values, and they would complement them with other values. So, for example, you could have, especially because the economic power, the financial power, the taxing power, and public finances would also have to be more decentralized in this kind of system that I'm imagining. And so in this system, you might have one member unit of the federation that is more socialistically inclined, and so perhaps its citizens would say want a stronger, a higher threshold of, let's say, welfare being provided by public entities, right? Public organizations, or government-sponsored organizations, and maybe in another region or another unit, they would be more kind of, let's say, favor more free enterprise and private initiative, and they would favor a lower threshold of let's say, government provided welfare, or they might favor a more intense form of public-private cooperation. And think of voucher systems. Like, say, I'm really in favor of voucher systems where you have a tax credit. Each citizen has a tax credit that they can apply to different services, so that you create a competitive system where different healthcare providers have to compete for citizens' tax credits, for example, and the citizens gets direct control over how their taxes are spent. So different regions of the country could experiment with different voucher systems. And these are very specific examples, but I think my main point is that, and the other phenomenon I wanted to mention was earlier, voting with your feet, that some of this fragmentation and polarization can be better managed when citizens can gravitate towards the types of governments that more closely match their ideological and philosophical commitments. And so you get this sorting effect, so that they're not just automatically subject to a national regulation, but that they can choose among 10 different jurisdictions that don't require emigrating to France, or to, maybe France wouldn't be your first preference, but just imagine another country you'd emigrate to get a better life. That's a huge cost. But in this federated system, moving to another city in your country is a much lower cost than emigrating to another nation and possibly learning another language, and all of the different customs and so on of that nation.
Yeah. So can I ask you something on this? So to me, to what degree is the polycentric republic similar or different to the original kind of vision for the United States? Because as you're describing it, it kind of feels like what the original constitution set out to achieve was something similar to what you've described. And why is this warped to a more centralized state in recent decades? It still has some of the components you've discussed. So, for instance, particularly during COVID, again, as an example, certain states had very oppressive policies, whereas others actually had more liberal policies, more free policies. And cultures were created during that time. And now places like San Francisco were once kind of seen as the free land of the free, and those who were creative and ambitious and independent could go live in this life of freedom in California. It's become the opposite now. It's now been permeated by this kind of woke ideology or authoritarian ideology, and by almost every measure that the area has deteriorated. But you've seen this mass migration, even of Silicon Valley. They've moved to Austin, Texas, because of the value system has now shifted. So they have that geographic immobility. So I've got a couple of questions on this, but to what degree then is the polycentric republic similar to what the United States was supposed to be in its conception?
Yeah, well, I would say, first of all, that the ideal of the polycentric republic is a diagnostic tool. It doesn't necessarily, it's not going to map perfectly onto any particular society today, because it is an ideal after all. It's quite a demanding ideal. It's basically pushing us to improve our systems, to try to bring them closer to a fully polycentric system, a bottom-up federal republic. And I have nothing against monarchy, because it's consistent with a constitutional monarchy, because I use republic more in the sense of a common thing that we all rally around. and common values. But in that sense, there are several different societies that approach the ideal in an imperfect way, and you could see elements of the ideal in them, and you could see where their shortfalls are as well. So, for example, the United States, currently today, the federal system, the states still retain very significant powers, as we saw during the pandemic, over things like healthcare, public hygiene, um, and even their welfare systems, although they've been conditioned increasingly by federal funding. There is room for some experimentation and diversity in the welfare systems. So, in that sense, the federal system in the United States, to a certain degree, does embody some of the advantages of a polycentric system, for sure. However, there are other aspects of the system that have become highly centralized in a very destructive way, particularly the concentration of financial power in Washington, D.C., in the federal government. A tremendous concentration of financial power. And that financial power has been abused, basically, in terms of, say, the public debt, increasing the public debt in an irresponsible manner, simply playing with votes in order to get elected. So the public debt has become a plaything of the Congress, I would say. That's how I would put it. And future generations are being held hostage by these public debts that they will have to pay. So there is an interesting argument to be had that perhaps the founding of the United States had the seeds of this centralizing process somehow embedded within the structures, because of the limited prerogatives that were held by the central government, that they had the capacity to expand those prerogatives over time, perhaps, and particularly what became known as the commerce power, I guess, the power to coordinate commerce. I'm not like an expert on American history, but this power in particular can be leveraged to justify all sorts of interventions and regulations by the federal government. That's just one example. But my sense is that power over science, over public finance, scientific regulation, all of these and many other issues, healthcare, these powers have really just, expanded beyond measure in the federal government. And in that sense, it's a degraded federal system, the United States. It's a degraded federal system, which has some good points to it and advantages, but it also is slipping towards an ever more centralized system. And that also manifests in the increasing political polarization, because the more power is concentrated in Washington, D.C., the more you're fanning the flames of political polarization, because the different segments of society are vying to control the central government. And that pathology is going to is likely to end up either in a civil war or in a peaceful separation. Let's say, in the best case scenario, a peaceful separation of certain states from the Union. I'm confident this will happen, because the only way this can be avoided, in my opinion, is if the federal government delegates powers back to the states and allows the states to manage a lot of polemic, controversial issues in their own terms, to defuse the polarization at the national level, and to confer greater legitimacy on the national government. Because the national government, when it tries to drive through to just wedge these solutions to these deeply polemical issues, is only delegitimating itself in the long run, in the eyes of citizens who are the losers. So the two paths I see in the future of the United States are: one, possibly in the best case scenario, a gradual, let's say, reform of the federal government, a kind of a decentralization of power to diffuse that polarization. Or the second scenario is a fragmentation of the union, where states will just withdraw from the union. And I don't think it's completely fanciful. I would have thought this was fanciful 10 years ago, but from what I've been seeing recently, I don't think it's fanciful at all.
Yeah. Well, David, on one hand, in recent weeks, we've seen the kind of federal order to break down the Department of Education, for instance, and put the power back into the states and local regions to manage their own education, which bizarrely, I mean, this is in the polarization. You've literally had groups of activists campaigning for decades, but now it's happened, and Trump was the one that did it. You've literally got the same people rejecting it. It's so confusing that the very same people who asked for this to change now don't want it because they are so polarized, which illustrates the problem. Now, I'm making jest of it, but it really does illustrate the problem of polarization, because you can get the outcome you want, but through a process that you don't agree with. And all of a sudden, you've got this massive breakdown in society. But on one hand, you've got that level of decentralization occurring to a degree. But on the other hand, I'm seeing an acceleration and an escalation of the centralization of the financial power in Washington. And I think to have decentralization of various capacities, whether it's health or education, which I think will also happen in the healthcare space, but all the while accumulating financial power in the central state, I think that's still going to lead to some of the outcomes that you described, because ultimately money drives the world. And if that power is concentrated in a single source, such as the federal state, then, or its influence over the federal state,
and
then you
it's
still
dangerous.
Yeah,
It's very, very dangerous to have that level of concentration of financial power, because you can't count on every future government being responsible in the use of that power. Whatever people might think of Trump, I can imagine much worse scenarios than Trump. And so, yeah, it's one issue that I do talk about a lot in the book, is the issue of economic power, and the fact that basically we are embodied beings who have material needs. And we're not just material beings, we're spiritual beings, we're emotional beings, we're mental beings, but we live and move in physical spaces, and we use physical stuff to live good lives, to live happy lives and full lives. And so that's why economics matters. I mean, that's why material well-being, material goods and material exchange really matter. And so the idea of reforming the political system and giving power back to the people and local communities, but retaining taxing and economic power at the center, is completely incoherent. It absolutely won't work. It won't work because then citizens' resources will be funneled away by a central authority and then applied to their favorite causes, the favorite causes of the central authority. And this is a frustration that I have, is that, we're taxed at relatively high levels, and it's not clear that those taxes are necessarily, coming back as, in a saying, being invested in worthy causes and helping to really make communities more vibrant. And that's a frustration I have, a personal frustration. But I think freedom and economic power, well, you know this very well from the courses you've done on your platform, they're completely inextricable. They're completely inextricable in the real world. Real freedom in the real world. Now, we're not going to talk about spiritual freedom in this podcast, but it is true that there's another level of freedom, which is kind of the freedom of the mystics and the freedom of people who are in concentration camps and find this inner core of freedom in themselves. I don't want to dismiss that freedom because it's very important. But let's just say that in society, I also value very much the freedom of our external life, our ability to make projects, to advance projects and our ends in the real world with people around us. And that's a freedom that's precious and that needs to be protected. And someone who ends up in a concentration camp or in a prison unjustly wants that freedom back naturally, even if they find a higher level of freedom, in spite of their circumstances, they still want that external freedom, which is so valuable. But my ideal is a free polycentric republic. A free republic means that there has to be a minimal shared culture among the constituent units of the republic. And I think we mentioned a few elements of that shared culture, but certainly there has to be an appreciation for the value of freedom, a minimal appreciation for the idea that, that we are masters of our own lives, that we should be able to, choose our own profession, for example, or line of work, that we should be able to choose our own marriage partner, that we should be able to own property, and we should not be taxed at prohibitively high levels, so that we can use our own resources, and certain basic rights, such as the rights of to associate freely with my peers, to build schools, to build universities, to fund them with my own resources if necessary. All of these kinds of things would be a shared part of the shared culture of the federation, and they'd have to be interpreted and worked out.
So what? I understand that. So what kind of large scale central coordination would you have? Would you have any form of centralized governance inside a polycentric republic? What would that look like? And would you still have taxation at the central level, for instance? Would you have something? How would that? I'm thinking about defense, infrastructure, global emergencies. So what degree would you? What level of power would you give to that central republic?
It's a bottom-up kind of structure, meaning that the constituent units pragmatically agree to delegate certain functions upwards because they see it's in their shared interests, right? So it's not that I, as a theorist, could decide in advance exactly which functions and how much power should be delegated at each level. At the local level, there has to be a decision about which issues are decided by civil society and solved by civil society, and which are solved by territorial government. Right, that's the first step. And let's say that there is a presumptive right to self-regulate on the part of civil society organizations with respect to their internal life. That includes schools, universities, even businesses. When there are common issues of concern to the wider community, then that can be solved either through the market and through voluntary cooperation, horizontal cooperation, or it could be solved through a territorial government, which acts coercively because it has police power, and it also has taxing power, which is a coercive power. And that kind of authority, I think it's especially well positioned to address issues like policing, urban planning, criminal law, tort law, security, and diplomatic relations with other parts of the federation. Let's say territorially conditioned diplomatic relations. So say you're representing your city, right? Well, I don't think I would just like Dan to represent my city because I'm part of a private association with him, and right? What standing would you have to represent my city if you weren't somehow elected or democratically legitimated? So it's obvious that diplomatic powers would have to have, some form of democratic legitimation, and therefore be part of the territorial government. And then the decision that's pragmatic is which of those powers to delegate to the regional and the federal level. It seems obvious that military defense would be something that would need to have a high level of national coordination. And in that sense, military powers, and they need to be financed. So that could justify a national tax that could be, let's say, devoted to defense, right, to financing defense functions. But but then people sometimes take that and then say, well, then why not we just tax everything else? We finance everything else with a national tax. And I'm saying no. I'm saying no. You need to define narrowly the functions, and then
Oh
you
shit.
might need to finance them, right? But the taxes are justified by the functions that they serve, right? It could be justified to have a national defense system, but that doesn't mean that you need a nationally financed, comprehensive healthcare system or something.
If you're still with us at this stage of the conversation, then you already know it's not enough simply to critique the system. We need new ways to live, to lead, and to connect. The truth is, many are caught in the tribal traps, unable to see beyond the left or the right or the false dichotomy that they've been given. And the thinking society is about rising above that. It's about reclaiming agency, fostering dialogue across divides, and building communities that can weather the storms ahead. To find out more, you can join our free live event and meet David Thunder and our other incredible instructors and take the first step towards real transformation. Reserve your spot now at weareelevate.org/thinking society. That's weareelevate.org/thinking society. You'll find the link below. Now back to the conversation with Dr. David Thunder.
In the real world that we live in, it's a world that is constituted by national centralized states. And we're not going to have a revolution where suddenly we're going to have all these independent communities that can make a society from scratch. So therefore, the reforms in the real world will have to have a strong top-down element because of the structures we live in. So they will require strong political leadership, but they will also have a bottom-up element because to the extent that we develop more resilience in our civil society structures and in our municipal governments and in our regional governments, they become, let's say, more robust and more persuasive, and they may have a greater bargaining power. So, like, say, the rise of the city-state, people talk about that, the rise of the city-state, large cities, urbanization. Like, this is the phenomenon we live under now. It's like everyone's talking about urbanization. Well, the fact is these urban centers are major population centers, they're major markets, they're major financial hubs. And so they may acquire enough, let's say, political and financial power that they may be able to kind of push back against. Sometimes they're just completely aligned with the state, right? But like, say, London, what's the difference between London and the national government, right, of England? Well, of course, they're closely aligned. But the phenomenon of urbanization will create greater power centers in cities. And it is conceivable that they could form a seedbed for a different kind of political structure that is more city-based and less nation-based. So that's one possible route towards change.
Yeah, so this brings up a few ideas or objections for myself. So let's suppose that city-state kind of manifestation plays out. If you have one city that becomes really competitive, I mean, so on one hand, I'm all in favor of the distribution of power. That for certain is clear, and bringing it closer to the people that are affected by it. But let's say you've got a super prosperous city that manages its own, in the absence of a national healthcare system, for instance, the wealth it generates enables it to deliver world-class health for its citizens in that cityscape. But then so many people migrate, you've got localized migration then, rather than necessarily national migration, although that would still play a role. And then you get the deterioration of another city because of the exodus from that city. So theoretically, it becomes like a more open, competitive, free market where, City B needs to raise its stakes in order to compete with City A. Otherwise, it will lose resources, it will lose population, and therefore it has to create a competitive offering in order to stand out. But theoretically, you could get an impoverished area, and we still get impoverished areas now, that cannot afford to provide the same level of service to its citizens because it's now reliant, it's self-dependent, which in many ways I think would actually, over the long term, that forced self-dependence would actually it's like kill or cure. Like you're either going to rise to the challenge, and it comes back to almost the dichotomy that we started with, is that we've got this idea that some people will take responsibility for their circumstances and others will seek to authority. If you have a delegated system in such a way or a distributed system, it requires individual areas, towns, cities, municipalities to become competitive in order to be able to deliver a level of services if it cannot rely upon a central state as backup. So does that then create some sort of national welfare that's not citizen-led, but is actually to bail out towns and cities if they fail to provide adequately? To me, I see a whole new wave of potential challenges. How do you view those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think these challenges are becoming more important now, and I think that the challenges are facing us whether we live in a highly polycentric system or live in a nationalized system. The challenge of migration and let's say the opposite of migration, like basically migration, and then the emptying of cities and towns. And also urbanization, also the decimation of economic life in rural areas as well, in more relatively rural areas. I think these are the challenges. These are major challenges facing our society today. And a polycentric system is not like a panacea that's going to automatically, solve these problems, right? It's not that there's a mechanism in polycentric governance that just automatically fixes those issues. I think that's a really important point to make, because I think what it does permit is, let's say, a more collaborative and horizontal approach to solving those problems, because the very fact that those cities have to rely more on their own resources confronts them much more viscerally with the problem they're facing. And they have incentives to work the problem with other members of the federation. In other words, they have to enter into partnerships and alliances with the big cities that have more successful systems. They're going to have to enter into partnerships with them or sink, in a sense, right? I mean, they're going to look at the more successful prototypes, the more successful instances of healthcare delivery, and they're going to have to see how can we replicate that in our area. And if we can't replicate it, can we purchase those services from a city that is doing it much better than us, right? So there's going to have to be a market for public services in the federation as well. And I would say there's also another factor which is already at work in the national state, but I think is going to be also present there, which is that if you live in a federation and you value mobility, you don't want areas of the federation to become no-go zones and to become completely impoverished, backward areas where really there's no public services. Because that's a recipe for social instability, for insecurity, for unrest, and even eventually for terrorism, potentially, right? So, I mean, in that sense, if you are in a federation, you want to, it may be in your interests to maintain some level of, let's call it a solidarity tax, to help to bridge the gap in some of these areas that are much less well off to provide those services. But as you can tell from, as I say this out loud, I'm already realizing it's such a complex and prudential issue. It really is working the problem and trying to use your imagination to work the problem collaboratively across the different actors. And the main difference is that now, presently, there's one actor that's sovereign, that has a kind of a major salience and a privileged position to solve these problems. And that is precisely the problem. It's the salience of the national government in solving these problems is why they're unsolvable right now, because its knowledge and its motivation are not properly aligned. You need all of the stakeholders around the table, not on a completely equal level, because some will be richer than others, some will be more successful than others, but let's say a more equal level than they are now, let's say, right? And with more dignity and more of a sense of independence. And so I'm not saying I'm offering a solution for these problems. I'm simply saying that they need to be worked on very intensely by all of the stakeholders involved. And there is no social engineering solution to these problems.
How then, David, would we transition to something like this? You've mentioned, in the US, possible prognosis of civil war, revolution. Do you see this as an evolutionary or revolutionary change? Is it part of a cycle of, centralization collapsing under its own weight? What would we need to shift in ourselves, culturally, institutionally, politically, for something like this to emerge?
A shift in our imagination is the first step, because I'm reminded of the movie The Matrix. Yeah, everybody thinks society, this is reality, everything they see around them, and the very idea that this might not be, that there are other possibilities, is inconceivable to them, because they're seeing the world as it's been fed to them, structured through a set of, well, in the Matrix, of course, it's like a dream almost that they're living in, right? But that's an analogy, of course. It's an image for what we live through. We are also fed a story. We're fed a set of ideas and parameters about how the world works. And if we want to change the world and we think these parameters are inadequate, the first thing we have to do is draw people's attention to the fact that there is actually a wider view of things. There are other possibilities. And that's why I wrote this book, right? I wrote this book because I wanted to help people to think outside the statist, sovereigntist framework that we've been given. Now, in a practical sense, this means educating the imagination, educating people with new ideas, even just agitating their imagination, like moving them to think in different terms and to think more creatively. So education plays a huge role. I also think leadership. This is not going to be a surprise to anyone, but I mean, these answers are old answers, but they're old for a reason, that we know that, because they're true. Leadership is what is like really shapes. So there are a few people in society who play a disproportionately important role in the evolution of society, of social life and political life. This has been true throughout history. It's been true throughout history. So this egalitarian idea that, like, we all move society forward equally. We all are equally responsible for the future of society. We're all responsible. Yes. We're co-responsible. Yes. We don't all have equal power and equal influence. There are some people who have leadership positions in society, or who assume leadership positions, and who help society to move forward or to shift out of the current paradigm. And these people, whether they be, they could be medics, they could be scientists, they could be politicians, they could even be academics. Even though we can be in the clouds a lot of the time, but still, even academics can have a role. And civil society leaders, church leaders, religious leaders, they all have a role in helping people reimagine their future and in pushing things in a different direction. And the other thing that I think is so important is building a stronger civil society. Because as long as civil society, and I mean this very broadly, I mean all sorts of social groups and initiatives and communities, if these are weak, then by default statism triumphs over them, in a sense, because the infrastructure of society is so weak that all of these functions are just delegated automatically to the state. But if civil society institutions and organizations are strengthened through strong leadership, through education, and through action, through just moving their muscles, as muscles will atrophy if we don't use them. So civil society needs to be active, and it needs to pursue its ends as energetically as possible. And this will kind of reduce the vacuum. It will create a new competitor, a rival to state bureaucracy. And as that rival becomes stronger, then local communities become stronger, and the claim or the demand for more local power, political power, becomes more credible when you have a stronger local civil society. And then the last thing is experimentation, because some people think that you want to change the whole of society. This is just crazy. How are you going to do this? It's just impossible. And I say to them, hold on a second. I never said it all has to change at the same time. Right? It's actually possible for one segment of the social fabric to change its DNA, initially. The opposite of a cancer. The opposite of a cancer. A constructive kind of form of, contamination or of contagion. The contagion of vibrant change. One part of society changes, like a town or a city. It just changes its structure and its way of doing things. And perhaps even it because of the crisis of the welfare state and the crisis in general of public finance, maybe a national government is so desperate that it says, you know what? We're going to allow this prototype, this city, to have more responsibility. And almost like in the Middle Ages when the king gave certain self-government rights to cities, and so if that happens, then that town or city or political unit becomes a beacon, an experiment, right? First, an experiment. Maybe it'll go wrong and then it'll be a failed experiment. Maybe it'll go right and then it'll be a beacon for other people to imitate. And that's how I envisage these changes happening, not through just the whole system kind of changing.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. Because as you were speaking previously, I was thinking, right, you could almost use the system to break or change the system. And I've had conversations along this lines with others around, forming a political party that basically campaigns on the idea of a new way of organizing, campaigns on the ideas that you've shared here today, the decentralized way. And actually, that does require leadership. So a strong leader who can compel that vision of what society could look like, what a nation state could look like, what a republic could look like in the way you described, or other ways, however it may be. But if that party then became elected, it would be their mandate of the people to actually enact the vision that they have put forth. Now, of course, there's going to be huge systemic forces to overcome, but nonetheless, that is always one route that I've seen to broad scale systemic change is campaigning on the vision of society that you have co-created with your members. However, you flipped the paradigm, because actually now thinking to myself, the kind of MVP of that, the minimum viable product, if I was to use a business term, would be to go and do that in your local area, to run on the same mandate, to prove the model here, with or without permission, frankly, David. Okay, you can get granted, it make things more seamless if you did get some sort of, agreements or rationale with the incumbent powers to avoid, potential tanks arriving at your borders or whatever, depending on where you enact this. But actually, in many ways, a more effective way to test it would be at the localized level, because you create something that is then repeatable. And business runs this way. Startups don't try and change the entire industry overnight. They test things at a small scale, prove that it works, and create demand. And in many ways, the lower the level of subsidiarity actually is a better way to prove it. If you can, in a small town or village, prove the model works, then you're actually demonstrating having that distributed power, that level of subsidiarity is more effective. And if you can rebel and actually find ways that, rejecting the national state involvement in many ways, and even, give your local village permission not to pay their taxes and defend them to the hills, you could potentially then showcase what this type of model could look like and force hands.
Yeah, I mean, independence.
Not without resistance, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, independence movements generally try to do this, but they often fall into a form of statism, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But they try to develop a narrative, a shared story. It's not an easy thing to do, but I think the issue is what independence fighters. I mean, political independence fighters. I'm not talking about terrorists here. I'm talking about, or even paramilitary or whatever. I'm talking about political independence fighters. What they understand is that you need to win the hearts and minds of people. You need to sell them a story, right? And you also need to give them incentives. You need to provide them with, show them that this will make them better off. In some sense, this way of doing things, and yes, it would be preferable if this was done in a kind of through a kind of an authorized prototype, but realistically, we might have to be in a more extreme crisis for that to happen. I think it will get worse before it gets better, probably. So I think then we may come to the point where these delegations of authority downwards will become a necessity of survival for national governments. That may well happen. But I do think we have to think in these two terms. One is political reform at the local level in the first place. But then we have to think about also market-based reforms in the broadest possible sense, voluntaristic forms of cooperation, like the formation of new civil society initiatives, like say in healthcare. In the United States, I had a friend who was in a healthcare insurance scheme that, basically it was a Christian, broadly speaking, Christian healthcare insurance scheme. And I don't think you had to be Christian to be in it, but basically they pool resources, and you have to sign an agreement about responsible lifestyle in order to enter the insurance scheme. And you have to commit to stop smoking, and stuff like that. And basically this insurance scheme dramatically brings down the costs of insurance, and they pay in cash upfront to the doctors. So the doctors accept lower payments because they get the payment in hand. And of course, the IRS, the tax authority, was all over them, but they were a charity. They're registered as a charity, and the IRS was like, "No, you're providing a service," or whatever. They found some legal grounds to go after them. But this is what I'm talking about. If you try to organize an initiative that makes people's lives better, sooner or later, you're probably going to come up against the state and its opposition. Yeah. And you have to be ready for that fight. That fight is going to happen. But it's worth it. It's worth the fight.
Well, I'm with you on that. Yeah. Wow, David, this has been a compelling conversation. And my inspiration is high off the back of this. I'm developing ideas and concepts as we're discussing this, provoked by what you've put together in your book. So thank you so much for what you've written. What's your hope for readers of the Polycentric Republic and for the ideas within it? Many of our listeners feel disillusioned with politics, the national state, and the institutions. What's your hope this book can help people to do differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think this book, I'm hoping that it will help people think about social order with new categories that are not as state-centric. So in a sense, to think beyond the inherited paradigms, of the central state, the centralized state, and to kind of look again at their life, look at society with a new lens, through a new lens. Look at society with an awareness of the non-state sources of order. The fact that even under the centralized state, if you actually look anew at society and you have the eyes to see, so to speak, you will start to notice how all of these different forms of cooperation and order are being generated, in a pretty grassroots way, in a pretty horizontal way. Even something as simple as a farmer's market. I mean, a farmer's market, look how they coordinate among themselves. Look at the level of commitment to keeping this going and so on. Look at how they see themselves giving benefits to the local community. And when you see that, that will reawaken your hope, I think, because you'll realize that we have the power to make things better through cooperation with our peers. And of course, things can become better, but you have to notice, first of all, what's really happening is that already this order is being generated on the ground, and so to think beyond the tired old category of national politics, that really, to think that social order is not just national politics, it's so much bigger than that, and think about civil society as well. Think about, your participation in your school, your some kind of educational institution, or through this platform itself. And think about all the good you're doing through that participation and how you're building resilience in your community through that participation. You're opening your mind. You're making yourself a better, a more responsible citizen. Because you have a bigger imagination. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of grounds for hope, and we shouldn't be so hung up on, whether the whole of society is better or not, is like dramatically better. We should be thinking about our battles and how this part of society that I'm interacting with can get better, and hopefully we will develop prototypes and models that then other people can learn from, and we can learn from other models as well. So that's that's what I'd say, I think.
Thank you, David. And for people at home who would like to get a copy of the book, where can they get access to what you put together?
Well, if they go to my website, davidthunder.com, it's listed in my publications, and they can download the preface and introduction for free. And also, if they are interested in purchasing it, they can find it on Amazon by just looking up The Polycentric Republic by David Thunder, or they can find it on the Routledge website. Possibly, it may be a little cheaper on the Routledge website. I'm not sure, but they should shop around anyway. But the Routledge website, that's Routledge, 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 is selling this book because that's the publisher, and it's also on familiar platforms like Amazon. So I don't know about your local bookshop. Probably may not have reached there yet.
Well, we'll see, and we'll link up the links where you can get it. And of course, David's work is published regularly on Substack as well. So check out davidthunder.substack.com. David, this has been a fascinating conversation. It's given us a glimpse into what's possible when we dare to question the dominant paradigm, when we dare to tap into our imagination, and to start to think about a system that is truly designed for human flourishing, and how we can move towards something like that. So if this episode has resonated with you at home, please do share it with someone who's eager to learn and think bigger about how we can organize ourselves in society. Please do pick up a copy of The Polycentric Republic. It's a bold vision for a post-centralized future. Do check out David's work at davidthunder.com and davidthunder.substack.com. We'll put those links in the description wherever you're watching or listening to this. So thank you again, David. And until next time, live free and prosper.
Thank you. Amen to that.
What a deep conversation. Huge thanks again to Dr. David Thunder for joining us today. I hope this discussion has challenged you, provoked you, and maybe even cracked open some new ways of thinking about the world that we're living through right now. Because whether we realize it or not, the old systems are crumbling, and the real opportunity lies in how we respond. If you want to go beyond the understanding of this breakdown, if you want to learn how to build what's next, then I highly encourage you to join us inside the Thinking Society. We've put together an incredible 6-part course designed to help you to think more critically, navigate complexity, and lead in time when leadership has never been more necessary. To find out more and to get a taste of what's coming, you can still join us at our free live event just head over to weareelevate.org/thinking society, and you'll get all the details linked in the show notes below. Plus, if you found this conversation valuable, it would mean the world to us if you just take a moment right now to hit the subscribe button on your favorite platform. Whether you're currently tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, Rumble, Odyssey, or anywhere else, subscribing ensures you never miss an episode, and it helps us to reach more independent thinkers just like you who are ready to live free and prosper. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious, live free, and we'll see you again on the Dan Astin-Gregory podcast.